of which describes the exploits of a knight who represents a moral virtue, such as chastity. The knights serve Gloriana, the fairy queen, who represents Queen Elizabeth I. Spencer had planned 12 books, but died in London at the age of 46 before completing his great work. Le Cid. Pierre Corneille. A verse tragedy in 5 acts, Le Cid by French tragedian Pierre Corneille is seen as the defining example of French neoclassical tragedy. Inspired by the story of Spain's national hero, El Cid, the play relates Le Cid's coming of age and an incident when he is asked by his father to challenge his future father-in-law to a duel. In so doing, he is forced to choose between the woman he loves and family honor. Paradise Lost. John Milton. Milton's masterwork, and a supreme triumph of rhythm and sound, the epic poem Paradise Lost relates the biblical story of the fall from grace of Adam and Eve, and hence of all humanity. Organized into 12 books for the final 1674 edition, the poem interweaves 2 themes, the rebellion of Satan against God and heaven, and the temptation of Adam and Eve and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. John Milton. English poet John Milton is best known for Paradise Lost, considered the greatest epic poem in the English language. Born in Cheapside, London, in 1608, he began writing while still a student. But with the outbreak of the English Civil War in 1642, he devoted himself to revolutionary politics, producing pamphlets defending religious and civil liberties. Following the execution of Charles I in 1649 and the overthrow of the English monarchy, he became secretary to the Council of State. Completely blind by 1654, he was able to continue working by dictating his verse and prose to an assistant. Following the Restoration in 1660, he devoted himself to producing his greatest literary works. He died in 1674 in London at the age of 65. Key works. 1644 Areopagitica, a speech for the liberty of unlicensed printing. 1667 Paradise Lost. 1671 Paradise Regained. 1671 Samson Agonists. Phèdre. Jean Racine. The dramatic tragedy Phèdre by French playwright Jean Racine is a supreme example of French neoclassicism. It consists of 5 acts written in verse, and takes its subject matter from Greek mythology that had already been explored by the classical dramatists Euripides and Seneca. Racine's play portrays the incestuous love of Phèdre. Married to the king of Athens, for her stepson Hippolyte who, shocked and in love with another woman, rejects her advances. The Princess of Cleves. Madame de la Fayette. The Princess of Cleves by French author Madame de la Fayette appeared at a time when women could not openly declare authorship, and was published anonymously. Seen as the first novel to explore the psychology of character, events take place at the royal court of Henry II of France, which Lafayette reproduces with historical accuracy. Her heroine, the Princess of Cleves, suppresses her love for a young nobleman, but misunderstandings and court intrigues damage her marriage. Gulliver's Travels. Jonathan Swift. An influential satirical novel by Anglo-Irish writer Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels is narrated by ship surgeon Lemuel Gulliver, who visits various fantasy regions: Lilliput, where inhabitants are 6 inches tall; Brobdingnag, a land of practical giants; Laputa, a flying island; Glubdubdrib, the island of sorcerers; and the land of the Howhams. Humorous and fantastical, Swift's novel lampoons travel books and pokes fun at much of contemporary society, satirizing political parties, religious dissenters, scientists, and philosophers, as well as mocking small-minded attitudes. Clarissa. Samuel Richardson. Clarissa, also entitled The History of a Young Lady, is an epistolary novel by Samuel Richardson and, at over 1,000,000 words, is one of the longest novels in the English language. It traces the tragic history of the virtuous heroine, Clarissa Harlowe, who is rejected by her family and abused by the unscrupulous Lovelace. Events are recounted mainly through a four-way correspondence of letters between Clarissa and her friend Miss Howe, and Lovelace to his friend John Belford. Samuel Richardson. A true man of letters, English novelist Samuel Richardson was born in Derbyshire in 1689 and is best remembered for developing the innovatory epistolary novel, in which the story is told through letters. Moving to London, where he had only a meagre education, something that would always trouble him, he became a master printer. Richardson's domestic life was tragic. His first wife died, as did his 6 children, and he married again. He was 50 when he wrote his first novel, becoming a popular and respected author. He died in 1761 of a stroke in London. Key works: 1740 Pamela, or, Virtue Rewarded 1747, 48 Clarissa. 1753 The History of Sir Charles Grandison. Tom Jones. Henry Fielding. A comic novel by English writer Henry Fielding, Tom Jones is one of the earliest works to be defined as a novel. It follows the adventures of the eponymous hero, a foundling who is brought up by the wealthy Squire Allworthy, and his pursuit of the virtuous Sophia Western. Rich in coincidences and misadventures, the novel makes a moral point in highlighting differences between the lusty but essentially well-meaning Tom Jones and his hypocritical half-brother, Blifil. Tristram Shandy. Lawrence Sterne. A bodily humorous novel, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, by Irish clergyman and writer Lawrence Sterne, was published in 9 volumes over 8 years, and is a fictionalized biography of its hero and a parody of the novels of its day. Narrated in an endless series of digressions and speculations by Shandy, the novel begins with his botched conception and then ambles through his life, introducing unfinished anecdotes, shifts in time, and various colorful characters: Shandy's parents, his uncle Toby and his servant Trim, the parson Yorick, and household servant Obadiah. Its experimental approach, as well as the erratic narrative, Sterne left some pages blank and littered others with asterisks, has led some to describe it as a forerunner of 20th-century stream-of-consciousness writing. I wish either my father or my mother, or indeed both of them, as they were in duty both equally bound to it, had minded what they were about when they begot me. Tristram Shandy. Lawrence Sterne. The Sorrows of Young Werther. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. A significant novel in the Sturm und Drang movement, The Sorrows of Young Werther established its 26-year-old German author, Goethe, as an internationally acclaimed writer. Completed in just 6 frenetic weeks, Goethe's debut novel is epistolary in form and loosely autobiographical. It consists of a series of letters written by the hero, Werther, a young artist in the Romantic tradition, to his friend William. The letters describe his tormented passion for a young woman, Lotte, who is promised to another. The novel's popularity was such that Werther fever spread across Europe, with young men adopting the dress and habits of its eponymous, tragic hero. It is certain that nothing on earth but love makes a person necessary. The Sorrows of Young Werther. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Songs of Innocence and of Experience. William Blake. Blake's Songs of Innocence and of Experience, masterpieces of English lyric poetry, rich in rhythmic subtlety, explore what the poet defined as 2 contrasting states of the human soul. Songs of Innocence, first published in 1789, portrays the innocence of childhood through the eyes of the child or as observed by adults. The edition of 1794 was expanded to include the contrasting Songs of Experience, including The Tiger and The Fly. These explore experiences of fear, aggression, conflict, and oppression, which come with the loss of innocence and childhood. William Blake. Born in Soho, London, in 1757, Blake left school at the age of 10. Profoundly influenced by the Bible from an early age, he experienced visions on angelic and heavenly themes throughout his life. Religious and spiritual motifs figured heavily in both his poetry and his engravings. After being apprenticed to a distinguished London printmaker, Blake developed his own method of relief etching in 1789, which he used in his finest illustrated works. Now considered the earliest and most original of the Romantic poets, at the time of his death in 1827 many contemporaries dismissed his work and regarded him as mad. Key works: 1794 Songs of Innocence and of Experience, 1804, 20 Jerusalem. Jacques the Fatalist. Denis Diderot. Published posthumously, Jacques the Fatalist and His Master by French Enlightenment philosopher and writer Diderot explores issues of moral responsibility, free will, and determinism. Much of the novel consists of dialogue between Jacques and his unnamed master who are riding through France. On his master's prompting they begin to talk about their loves. A picture emerges not just of 18th-century France, but also of a world in which events occur at random and, as personified by Jacques, where history determines an individual's fate. Diderot's novel is complex and multi-layered. The haphazard progress of Jacques' journey is frequently interrupted by long, often comedic digressions, other characters, other narratives, and chance events. This playful and modern narrative style has led to Diderot's book being hailed as a precursor of the 20th century novel. Introduction. The late 18th century was a period of revolutionary change across Europe. The Enlightenment, or Age of Reason, had fostered the scientific advances that brought about the Industrial Revolution, as well as the various philosophical ideas that had led to the political revolutions in North America and France. The effects of growing industrialization and urbanization on society had a significant impact on the way that many people lived and worked. During the Renaissance and the Enlightenment periods, humankind and reason were the twin focuses of cultural interest. But in the early 19th century, the individual came to the fore. Partly as a reaction to the cool rationality of the Enlightenment, a movement in the arts arose, which placed emphasis on subjective feelings and faculties such as intuition, imagination, and emotion. This movement became known as Romanticism. Romantic literature. Romanticism had its roots in the German Sturm und Drang movement, from which the writers Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Friedrich Schiller emerged. In this transition from the classical style of the Enlightenment to 19th-century Romanticism, they introduced the idea of an unconventional protagonist whose actions are less important than his thoughts and feelings. This romantic hero later became more of an anti-establishment figure, epitomizing the rebellious spirit of the period, and a recurrent character in the growing number of novels that appeared at the time. By the mid-19th century, Romanticism had spread across Europe to Russia, and writers such as Alexander Pushkin, Mikhail Lermontov, and Ivan Turgenev developed the idea into that of the superfluous man, whose unorthodox ideas isolate him completely from society. Another characteristic of Romantic literature was an affinity with the natural world. English poets such as William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge offered an antidote to the industrial age by portraying the beauty and power of nature, and celebrating the innocence and impulsiveness of childhood. A similar reaction to urbanization was evident in the work of American transcendentalist writers Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Walt Whitman, who evoked the spirit of humanitarian liberty, culminating in their call to go back to nature. Gothic novels. However, many Romantic writers recognize that nature also has a dark side, and can arouse feelings of terror as well as pleasure. This fascination with the destructive power of nature, and even the supernatural, inspired the genre that came to be known as Gothic literature. The tone was set in Germany by Goethe's play Faust, and the short stories by E.T.A. Hoffmann, but the genre was most eagerly adopted by English novelists, such as Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Elements of the Gothic run through many Victorian novels, often stressing the untamable nature of a romantic hero in a wild landscape, as in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, or the grotesque characters in grim urban surroundings that feature in the works of Charles Dickens. The genre also became popular in the USA, as exemplified by Edgar Allan Poe's Tales of the Macabre, it also influenced the style adopted by Herman Melville in his haunting short stories and Moby Dick. History and identity. As society industrialized, levels of literacy increased, and literature was no longer solely for an educated elite. Novels in particular reached a mass readership in 19th-century Europe and the USA, and many were made available in serial form. Especially popular were historical novels by the likes of Walter Scott, Alexander Dumas, and James Fenimore Cooper, which catered for an urban public's desire for romance and adventure, but included graver fare such as Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. There was also an appetite for folk stories and fairy tales which, like historical novels, were often specific to a culture. This focus on regional traditions chimed with the era's growing nationalism. As well as a broader readership, increased literacy spawned a greater variety of authors, most noticeably a generation of women writers such as the Bronte sisters and George Eliot of England, who pioneered a female perspective in literature, and the first freed slaves, such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, and Solomon Northup, who gave a voice to the USA's oppressed black people. In context. Focus. The English Romantic poets before 1794. William Blake's Songs of Innocence and of Experience marks the early phase of Romanticism, anticipating the esteem placed by Wordsworth on the purity of childhood and giving a voice to society's marginalized figures. After 1818. Percy Bysshe Shelley's sonnet about the statue of Ozymandias points to a romantic interest in the insignificance of man. 1819. Romantic poetry's link with intoxicants, death, and the imagination is expressed in John Keats's poem Ode to a Nightingale. 1818, 1823. Lord Byron's Don Juan, cynical, subversive, and witty, undermines his earlier romanticism. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge were two of the Lake Poets, so called because they lived and wrote in the inspirational setting of England's Lake District. The friends collaborated on the Lyrical Ballads, a collection of romantic verse with the ambition to follow the fluxes and refluxes of the mind when agitated by the great and simple affections of our nature. In part a reaction to the acute rationalism of the industrial age, English Romanticism took human experience, imagination, nature, and individualistic freedom as its inspiration. Democratizing poetry. Lyrical Ballads starts with The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Coleridge's 7-part ballad with otherworldly overtones. It was agreed that supernatural poetry with a semblance of truth would be this writer's remit. Wordsworth's brief was to give the charm of novelty to everyday life and awaken the reader to the loveliness of the familiar. Both writers believed that poetry should be written in transparent, unadorned language for the general populace, with simple meter and rhyme, and chose subject matter consistent with this. Democratizing impulse, the lives of uneducated rustic folk, whose emotions were pure and universal. Poems dealing with royalty or lofty allegory were replaced with themes of poverty, crime, and madness. Purity and reflection. Some of Wordsworth's poems focus on children, whom he thought lived closer to nature and form a bond with it, childhood being a time of innocence, impulse, and play. Most of the poems are deeply felt rather than deeply thought, but two have a more reflective manner: Coleridge's The Nightingale, a conversational poem, and Wordsworth's Lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey. See also, Songs of Innocence and of Experience. In context. Focus. German Romanticism before 1797, 99. Best known as a poet, Friedrich Hölderlin writes the lyrical and tragic two-part novel Hyperion. The book reflects the typically German romantic fascination with ancient Greek culture. After 1821, Heinrich von Kleist's The Prince of Hamburg is staged for the first time, 10 years after the author's death by suicide. The patriotic play, in which the prince fails to follow orders and faints in a dream scene, has been edited so as not to offend the Prussian elite. 1827. The Book of Songs by Heinrich Heine is published. A 5-section collection of romantic poetry that wins Heine fame. Many of the poems were later set to music by Franz Schubert and Robert Schumann. German Romanticism came after, and was a reaction to, Weimar Classicism. Its proponents rejected calm restraint and cared only about the artist's perceptions. Romantic literature in Germany looked to the medieval past as a period of intellectual simplicity that could be recreated. It also explored the supernatural, the uncanny, and the fantastical as realms of the imagination. The Romantics wanted the world to become dreamlike, and for dreams to be so realistic they resembled the world. German Romanticism tended to be less serious than British Romanticism, and often made use of playful wit. He puts their eyes in a bag and carries them to the crescent moon to feed his own children. The Sandman. Dark Revelations. Nachtstuck by E.T.A. Hoffmann, from Königsberg in Prussia, is a collection of 8 short stories that combine a spirit of lightheartedness with darker themes of human irrationality. The stories are written in a simple and populist tone, accessible to all, and not self-consciously intellectual. Hoffmann was a musician, rather than a writer. Nachtstuck is a musical title, and one of many German Romantic texts that were adapted into songs or operas. The most famous of the stories is The Sandman, in which this traditionally sympathetic figure, who blesses children with their dreams, is revealed as a monster who instead plucks out their eyes. The Gothic and fantastical tales offer a disturbing insight into the human psyche and the individual's struggle to feel at ease in society. See also, The Robbers, The Sorrows of Young Werther, Lyrical Ballads, Faust, Frankenstein. In context. Focus. Weimar Classicism before 1776. Under the auspices of the young Goethe, German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder comes to Weimar and begins to write works on literary aesthetics that hark back to the values of the Greek classics. His ideas provide the philosophical underpinning for the movement known as Weimar Classicism. 1794. Friedrich von Schiller writes to Goethe. Their friendship, after they meet in Weimar, forms the backbone of Weimar Classicism. 1799. Schiller completes his Wallenstein drama trilogy, often said to be the greatest historical drama in the German language and a key work of Weimar Classicism. It was not until shortly before his death in 1832 that Johann Wolfgang von Goethe finally completed the work for which he is best remembered, Faust, a tragic play in 2 parts, the first of which was completed in 1808. Faust is also the most notable achievement of the movement known as Weimar Classicism, a period of prolific cultural and literary activity centered on the German city of Weimar, which began in the 1780s and lasted for nearly 30 years. The 2 writers most closely associated with Weimar Classicism are Goethe and his friend and collaborator, the playwright Friedrich von Schiller. As young men, both had been involved with the late 18th century movement known as Sturm und Drang, which featured novels and plays that broke with the literary traditions of the Enlightenment and promoted passionate emotional expression. However, in the 1780s, as the fire of their youth subsided, Goethe and Schiller began to look back at the Enlightenment values that they had previously rejected, reconciling them with the energy of Sturm und Drang, and revisiting the Greek classics with a view to creating new and finer aesthetic standards. Age is no second childhood, age makes plain, children we were, true children we remain. Faust. Collaborative Classicism. Weimar Classicism is often regarded as Goethe and Schiller's joint achievement, although it included other writers, notably the philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder and Christoph Martin Wieland, a poet and novelist. In formulating their ideas about good literature, Goethe and Schiller agreed that aesthetic perfection was an impossible goal. Instead, they emphasized the importance of balance and harmony, arguing that a literary work could be considered great if it existed in perfect balance with its own imperfect elements. In this way, a work could achieve the unity in wholeness that the authors of the Greek classics had sought. This balance, according to Goethe and Schiller, was achieved by a combination of the 3 elements essential to a work of art. The first, Gehalt, the author's primary inspiration or vision, combined with the second, Gestalt, the aesthetic form of the work, which might be based on close study of classical models. The third element, the Inhalt, is the bulk of the author's invention, the content or, in effect, the words in a work of literature. The Inhalt is therefore the element that must be managed carefully because it can create an imbalance that could distract from the Gehalt and the Gestalt. Goethe and Schiller collaborated on each other's productions and encouraged one another. It was Schiller who insisted that Goethe should return to his work on Faust, a work he had begun in his 20s and later put to one side. The two men corresponded daily until Schiller's death in 1805, a date many critics take to be the end of Weimar classicism. Weimar classicism argued that works of aesthetic harmony could be created if an author had the skill to keep three key elements in balance. Here deeds have understood words they were darkened by, the eternal feminine, draws us on high. Faust. A universe on stage. The story of Faust is based on many popular legends about pacts with the devil that circulated throughout Europe from the early 16th century onwards, and which had inspired Christopher Marlowe's 1604 play, Dr. Faustus, among others. While earlier versions presented the Faust legend as a relatively simple contest between God and the devil, or between good and evil, Goethe's Faust is a more profound tale that moves beyond simple morality. Goethe argues that through living, doing, and striving humans may make mistakes, but that learning from these mistakes will lead them to righteousness. Goethe starts his play with a prologue. Here a director, a poet, and a clown discuss what characteristics are needed to make a good play. Each has his own agenda. The director wishes to make a play that will draw in the crowds and be well received by its German audience. The poet is an idealist, trying to portray eternal values and make a work of integrity and inspiration, a masterpiece that will endure, and the clown wishes to entertain the audience through comedy and action. The three finally reach a compromise. The poet can create a play with profound meaning as long as it includes action, comedy, and tragedy. The discussion ends with a promise to the audience that the whole universe, from heaven via the world to hell, will be presented on the stage. Faust, Part 1 begins in heaven where Mephistopheles muses on mankind and wagers with God that he can turn one of God's favorite subjects, Faust, to sinful ways and win his soul. God accepts the bet but asserts his belief that Faust will stay faithful, pointing out that while a man may make mistakes in his life, he is basically good. A man who sells his soul for worldly gain is an idea that has long captivated writers. Part 1 of Goethe's play inspired Charles Gounod's opera. Here, Bryn Terfel plays Mephistopheles. A deadly deal. Moving the action to earth with its contemporary German setting, Goethe introduces Faust, a learned professor, doctor, and theologian. Faust is sitting in his study in despair, feeling that he has reached the limit of his learning and that he is merely a wretched fool, no wiser than I was before. He even contemplates suicide. The devil appears and an agreement is made between the two. Mephistopheles agrees to fulfill Faust's wishes on earth. In return Faust will serve the devil in hell. As part of the deal, Faust declares that if the devil can provide him with a moment that is so absolutely rewarding that he wishes to remain in it forever, then he will die at that precise moment. The pact is signed in blood. Faust meets and is attracted to a young woman called Gretchen. With the devil's help, he seduces her, but what Faust hoped would bring happiness quickly turns to death and tragedy, and in this first part, Faust is denied fulfillment. Faust, Part 2 is the more complex part of the tragedy. It consists of 5 acts, each different from the others, which leap around between settings, real, magical, historical, and mythical. In effect Goethe, having explored Faust's personal small world in Part 1, now places events in the wider world. Part 2 introduces many fantastical, and often confusing, plot strands, such as the marriage of Faust to Helen of Troy. Whoever strives, in his endeavor, we can rescue from the devil. Faust. A literary landmark. Faust typifies Weimar classicism in its richness of classical allusion. The play's characters include gods, goddesses, and heroes from Greek mythology in settings from classical antiquity. It is written in a staggering array of literary styles, referencing Greek tragedies as well as mystery plays about biblical subjects, which were popular in the Middle Ages. It takes inspiration from Renaissance masque and commedia dell'arte, and makes use of a variety of poetic forms. Faust is without question the greatest accomplishment of Weimar classicism, yet it took such an astonishingly long time to complete, that by the time Part 2 was published, a few months before Goethe's own death in 1832, the movement had long finished. Faust did not exert a strong influence on the next generation of writers, since many had already published numerous works by the time of the play's appearance. Instead, German Romanticism held sway across much of Europe. Despite its lack of contemporary influence, Faust went on to become one of the most famous and studied works of German literature, and is now considered one of the greatest plays ever written. Weimar's Courtyard of the Muses, painted by Theobald von Oer in 1860, depicts Goethe opposite Schiller, with Herder and Wieland seated behind. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Born on August 28, 1749 in Frankfurt to a wealthy middle-class family, Goethe was not only a great writer and literary figure but also knowledgeable in many fields from law and philosophy through to botany, zoology, science, and medicine. Goethe was home-tutored until 1765 when he was sent to Leipzig to study law. There he began to write lyric poetry and his first full-length plays. After graduation, he continued writing, establishing his reputation as an innovatory and outstanding writer. In 1775 he was invited to take a position at the Weimar court, where he held public offices for 10 years. In 1786 he left for a 2-year tour of Italy. From around 1794 he began a collaboration with Friedrich von Schiller that resulted in some sublime and influential literary and cultural work. He died on March 22, 1832. Other key works. 1773 Götz von Berlichingen, 1774 The Sorrows of Young Werther. 1795-96 Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. See also, Dr. Faustus the Robber's Les Liaisons Dangereuses, The Sorrows of Young Werther, The Magic Mountain, The Catcher in the Rye. In context. Focus. Folklore collections before. See point 1350, 1410 Welsh stories based on oral tales are collected in the Mabinogion, the earliest prose literature of Britain. 1697 French author Charles Perrault writes Tales of Mother Goose, a collection of rewritten and original tales. 1782-87 German author Johann Karl August Musaus publishes a popular collection of satirical folk stories. After 1835, 49 Finnish folklore is celebrated in the epic poem The Kalevala by Elias Lönnrot. 1841 Norwegian folktales, by Peter Christen Asbjornsen and Jørgen Moe, is published. 1979 The Bloody Chamber, by English novelist Angela Carter, challenges traditional folktale portrayals of women. Folklore collections that synthesize into a single written text cultural traditions such as fairy tales, oral history, and popular beliefs have been compiled since the Middle Ages. The term fairy tale was coined by French writer Madame d'Aulnoy in the late 17th century, but it is her contemporary Charles Perrault's retellings of old fairy tales that are better known. English antiquarian William Toms first defined folklore in a letter to the Athenaeum magazine in 1846. Some tales, such as the 14th-century Welsh Mabinogion, have a religious or spiritual function, but folk stories do not usually contain references to religion. Real places, people, or events are not cited. Instead, these stories are ahistorical, existing once upon a time. And readers and audiences expect stock characters, random magic, reward and revenge, and a happily ever after ending. Poetic or literary references and realism are rarely used. Fairy tales are written in a plain style, using mainly straightforward imagery, and plot is key, these stories power along with astonishing swiftness. In olden days, when wishing still worked. Children's and household tales. Enriching Western culture. The Brothers Grimm, like many folklorists since, embarked on a scholarly project to identify and preserve the spirit of the people by recording the fairy tales being told across their culture. This was an epic romantic venture. Interest in folklore was inspired by a rise in nationalism and cultural pride, and the purpose of the Grimm's collection was no different. Nor were they the only European scholars to undertake such an enterprise, and their peer group at university shared their enthusiasm for folk traditions. But the Grimm's work, as reflected in their children's and household tales, represents the greatest body of stories collected in Europe and is the most widely translated and read. W. H. Auden declared Grimm's tales among the few common property books upon which Western culture can be founded. The methodology for gathering stories did not include sorties into the woods, as is often picturesquely believed. The Grimm sources generally came to them, and some stories were already written down, such as The Juniper Tree, sent to them by painter Philip Otto Runge. In their first edition, the Grimms wrote for a mainly adult audience. It was only after Edgar Taylor's English translation of their work in 1823 was successful with children that they made revisions to sanitize the German stories. For example, their first version of Rapunzel openly referred to her pregnancy, but in the revised version she simply fattens. Yet violence was not necessarily minimized. The French Cinderella, Cinderlin, in Charles Perrault's tale, forgives her stepsisters and finds good husbands for them. But in the Grimm's punitive version, Cinderella's helper birds blind the sisters by pecking out their eyes. Violence notwithstanding, the popularity of the Grimm's collected tales has endured, and they have sustained multiple interpretations and rewrites in various media over the years. The romantic depiction of Once Upon a Time continues to manifest inextinguishable truths, which, along with the allure of a happy and harmonious ending, appeal across the generations. Jacob Grimm and Wilhelm Grimm. Known as the Brothers Grimm, Jacob and Wilhelm were celebrated German academics, cultural researchers, linguists, and lexicographers. The oldest surviving sons of a family of 6 children, they were raised in Hanau, Hesse. Despite poverty following the death of their lawyer father, they were educated at the University of Marburg, thanks to a well-connected aunt. The Grimms are credited with developing an early methodology for collecting folk stories that is now the basis of folklore studies. They were also notable philologists. Both brothers also worked on a monumental German dictionary, which was unfinished in their lifetimes. Other key works. 1813, 16 Old German Forest. 1815 Poor Heinrich by Hartmann von der Au. 1815 Songs from the Elder Edda. 1816, 18 German Sagas. 1852, 1960 German Dictionary. See also, 1001 Nights Fairy Tales Kalevala the Bloody Chamber. In context. Focus. The Novel of Manners Before. 1740 English author Samuel Richardson's Pamela is a story about a servant girl climbing the social ranks. It is considered to be an early novel of manners. After. 1847 Jane Eyre, by Charlotte Brontë, critiques Victorian class divisions and prejudice, as well as the constricting expectations faced by women. 1847, 48 The duplicity and dishonesty of society life are satirized via the exploits of Becky Sharp in Vanity Fair, by English novelist William Makepeace Thackeray. 1905 An American Novel of Manners, Edith Wharton's The House of Mirth reflects the social, economic, and moral constraints that are placed on women. The early to mid-18th century saw the rise of the novel and, a little later, the development of Romanticism in literature. By the close of the 18th century, however, a new genre had emerged in England, the novel of manners, which moved away from the excesses of emotion and flights of fancy common to Romanticism. Instead, it placed emphasis on the beliefs, manners, and social structures of particular groups of people. These novels were often dominated by women, both as authors and as protagonists, and for this reason were sometimes wrongly dismissed as trivial. Jane Austen's novels are the prime examples of such literature, gently satirizing the social mores of the English country gentry, as well as poking fun at the overindulgent drama of Gothic romanticism. Austen highlights the vulgarities and follies of the English upper classes, the importance of rank, the stigma of social inferiority, and the system of patronage are played out via balls, visits, and society gossip. A lady's imagination is very rapid, it jumps from admiration to love, from love to matrimony in a moment. Pride and Prejudice. Social ups and downs. In Pride and Prejudice, the reader follows the Bennet sisters in their quest for an eligible bachelor. For women, a good marriage was key to maintaining or improving one's social status. The novel is told mainly through the eyes of its principal character, Elizabeth Bennet. A good and well-intentioned young woman. She is one of the 5 daughters of the intelligent but put-upon Mr. Bennet, a country gentleman, and his pushy, vulgar wife, their own marriage being a perfect example of how not to do it. Elizabeth meets the aristocratic Fitzwilliam Darcy, who is drawn to her despite himself. However, she finds his haughty pride and his supercilious behavior offensive. He is contrasted with his equally wealthy but unaffected friend, Bingley, who takes a liking to Elizabeth's older sister, Jane. Yet when the flighty younger sister, Lydia, scandalously elopes with the dashing officer George Wickham, threatening to disgrace the entire family, it is Darcy who unexpectedly steps in to help. Elizabeth's pride, prejudice, and inexperience lead her to make errors of judgment that she must pay for, but through these trials, she grows into a mature adult. Darcy, similarly, has to grow out of his own pride to prove he is a worthy match for her, in spite of his higher social class. Indeed, through the use of subtle wit and irony, Austen makes clear that good breeding does not necessarily equate with good manners. While the landscape of Pride and Prejudice might appear to be narrow, it nevertheless keenly probes the manners and morals of its day. Jane Austen. The daughter of a relatively prosperous country parson, Jane Austen was born in Steventon Rectory, Hampshire, England, in 1775, the 7th of 8 children. As a child she read voraciously, having access to her father's library, which was uncommon for girls at the time. She started writing in her early teens, producing an embryonic version of Pride and Prejudice, entitled First Impressions, between 1796 and 1797. In 1800 her father decided to retire and the family moved to Bath. Jane was unhappy there. In 1809 she moved to Chawton, Hampshire, with her mother and sister, where she wrote daily. It was her observations of genteel life in Hampshire that furnished her novels. Despite writing a great deal about marriage, she never married herself, although she did receive a proposal. She died in 1817, at the age of 41. Other key works. 1811 Sense and Sensibility, 1814 Mansfield Park, 1815 Emma, 1818 Northanger Abbey, 1818 Persuasion. See also, Jane Eyre, Vanity Fair, North and South Middlemarch. In context. Focus Early Gothic. Before 1764 The Castle of Otranto by English writer Horace Walpole is published. It is later hailed as the origin of Gothic fiction. 1794 English author Anne Radcliffe publishes her novel The Mysteries of Udolpho, introducing readers to the dark, romanticized, and brooding Gothic hero. 1796 Inspired by Radcliffe's novels and German horror stories, Englishman Matthew Lewis writes The Monk, one of the most sensationalist Gothic novels of the period. 1817 E. T. A. Hoffmann, from Prussia, writes a collection of short stories, Nacktstuck, that includes his now famous tale, The Sandman, which blends romantic philosophy with Gothic themes of horror and irrationality. Gothic fiction established its main themes in the late 18th century, years before the publication of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Works such as Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, and Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, and E. T. A. Hoffman's Knackstuck, set out the key elements of the genre. In these books, exiles roam sublime foreign landscapes, or are trapped in ruined castles in nightmarish tales of abuse, tyranny, and murder. At the heart of early Gothic fiction was a combination of romantic preoccupations with the power of the mind, the limits of the imagination, and contemporary social questions, coupled with Gothic tropes of evil aristocratic villains, gory deaths, and gloomy medieval settings. This mixture was frequently embodied in beings such as vampires, ghosts, monsters, and terrifying and mysterious female figures. In Frankenstein, Mary Shelley expanded on these elements, linking them to wider philosophical debates, and forever changing the Gothic genre in the process. The inspiration for the novel came from conversations she had with, among others, the English Romantic poets Percy Bysshe Shelley and Lord Byron. One evening, the group told stories around the fire, as a storm raged outside. Byron suggested they devise ghost stories, and Mary Shelley's imagination was stirred. Frankenstein. An unsettling age. Although the stormy origins of Frankenstein are perhaps fitting, the novel is much more than a simple tale of terror. One of Shelley's most significant contributions to the Gothic genre is her ability to expand on the stock themes of persecution, threat, and monstrous hauntings into a more sophisticated exploration of one of the key romantic preoccupations of the period, the alienated individual in the modern world. A fable for the times. The title name of Frankenstein refers not to the infamous monster, but to Victor Frankenstein, the novel's protagonist, the scientist, artist, and creator of the unnamed creature whom he describes as the demoniacal corpse to which I had so miserably given life. Frankenstein is a solitary creative genius, whose secret horror stems from within, as he overreaches the ethical laws of humankind in typical romantic fashion. Through him, Shelley reworks the Gothic theme of monstrosity in the form of the idealized persona of the exiled or wandering outsider. As scholar David Punter suggests, the book focuses on rejection of the strange, at both social and psychological levels. Frankenstein's monster is a product of the moment of his creation in the new and unsettling age of industrialization and of the author's negotiation of the political and social upheaval of the time. The horror of Frankenstein lies not with its monster but rather, in its melding of key Gothic tropes of haunting, exile, and isolation, with the anxieties of the period that so preoccupied the Romantics, such as questions about religion versus science, philosophies of justice, debates about the origins of life, and the role of education, culture, and nurture in shaping identity. Frankenstein's downfall through his own monstrous creation is the ultimate modern fable, cleverly wrapping moral and social issues in the guise of Gothic terror. Mary Shelley. The birth of novelist Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley on August 30, 1797 in London, England, was closely followed by the death of her mother, the feminist author Mary Wollstonecraft, 11 days later. Her father was the radical philosopher William Godwin. At the age of 14, Shelley was sent to live in Scotland. In 1814 she returned to her father's London home and met the young poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. He was already married, but the pair eloped to Europe and wed in 1816. It was a loving but tragic union. Only one of their 4 children survived, and in 1822 Percy drowned. Mary wrote until her death in 1851. She is best remembered for her novel Frankenstein, which she began drafting in 1816, during happier times with her husband and their circle of close friends. Other key works: 1817 History of a 6 Weeks Tour, 1819 Matilda, 1826 The Last Man, 1830 The Fortunes of Perkin Warbeck, 1835 Lodore. See also, Dr. Faustus Knackstuck Faust Wuthering Heights, The Picture of Dorian Gray Dracula. In context. Focus. The historical novel before. 1800 Anglo-Irish writer Maria Edgeworth's Castle Rackrent is in the vanguard of a fashion for historical fiction. 1814 Waverley, by Scottish writer Walter Scott, is the first in a series of historical novels that includes Rob Roy and Ivanhoe. 1823, 41 U.S. author James Fenimore Cooper writes his Leatherstocking Tales, historical fictions that include the pioneers and the last of the Mohicans. After 1829 Honoré de Balzac's The Chouans tells of the 1799 Royalist uprising in France. 1989 Gabriel Garcia Marquez's The General in His Labyrinth is a postmodern historical novel about Simon Bolivar, liberator of South America. Although the idea of setting a novel in a previous period of history was not a new one, fictional tales of the past are as old as literature itself. The historical novel as a distinct genre achieved unprecedented popularity in the 19th century. Demand came first in Britain, and was stimulated by the novels of the Scottish writer Sir Walter Scott, which appeared between 1814 and 1832. These had a huge readership, in Britain and abroad, and their success inspired a wave of similarly themed novels. By the 1820s, the influence of Scott's novels in particular had spread as far as the USA, where James Fenimore Cooper wrote the popular Leatherstocking Tales. Translations of British historical fiction were also creating a market for the genre across Europe, notably in France, where it was taken up by writers such as Victor Hugo and Honoré de Balzac. The most popular of the French historical authors, however, was Alexandre Dumas. Never fear quarrels, but seek hazardous adventures. The Three Musketeers. A thirst for adventure. The first of Dumas' novels, The Three Musketeers, appeared in serial form in 1844, and almost immediately made him a household name. The novel contained all the ingredients of the popular fiction of the time: dashing, romantic heroes and wily villains, plots involving derring-do and camaraderie, and the backdrop of a period that was well known to its readers for political intrigue. At the time of the book's publication, France had undergone a turbulent period post-revolution. Tensions between monarchists and republicans were unresolved, and the romantic depiction of a fictionalized past appealed to those yearning for a more settled time. At the heart of Dumas' story is D'Artagnan, a young nobleman who leaves his home in Gascony to join the Musketeers of the Guard in Paris, in 1623. Through a series of misadventures, his ambition is thwarted, but he ends up first dueling with, and then befriending, the three musketeers of the title, Athos, Porthos, and Aramis. Together they embark on a series of missions to save the honor of the Queen, and to ensure that the king is not hoodwinked by the machinations of First Minister Cardinal de Richelieu into a war with the English. Along the way, there is much carousing, and inevitable romantic liaisons. Beneath the swashbuckling, however, Dumas makes some serious points, and is critical in his portrayal of the period. His musketeer heroes are brave and attractive, but show a blind allegiance to the monarchy, and are not always gentlemanly in their treatment of others. And the object of their loyalty, King Louis XIII, is portrayed as gullible and weak. He is ruthlessly manipulated by the cardinal and his agents, the Comte de Rochefort and Milady de Winter. The installments of the story were eagerly awaited by the French public in the summer of 1844, and were translated widely. Building on this success, Dumas serialized two further D'Artagnan romances, 20 years after, in The Vicomte of Bragelonne, and the similarly styled The Count of Monte Cristo, all of which have remained popular, both in their original novel form and as adaptations for television and the cinema. The Musketeers of the Guard, a brotherhood of bodyguards, are the focal point of a story that combines international politics, courtly intrigue, friendship, enmity, and romantic entanglements, a historical tale with timeless themes that guarantee its enduring popularity. Alexandre Dumas. Alexandre Dumas was born Alexandre Davy de la Pelletrie in Picardy, France, in 1802. His father was the son of the governor of Saint-Domingue and an Afro-Caribbean slave woman, Marie-Cécile Dumas. Like his father, Alexander later adopted the surname of his grandmother, but it was his aristocratic ancestry that helped to launch his career as a writer. He found work with the Duke of Orleans, and after initial success with historical drama, turned to writing novels. These included The Adventures of D'Artagnan, for which he became famous. When Louis-Philippe was deposed, Dumas fled France in 1851 and did not return until 1864. Dumas had many affairs, and is said to have fathered at least 4 children, including a son Alexander, who also became a writer and is often known as Fils. Other key works. 1845 20 years after. 1847, 50 The Vicomte of Bragelonne. See also, Ivanhoe the Last of the Mohicans, Les Miserables, War and Peace, A Tale of Two Cities. In context. Focus. The Superfluous Man Before. 1812, 24 English poet Lord Byron's characters Childe Harold and Don Juan are the precursors of the superfluous man in Russian literature. After. 1840 Mikhail Lermontov's only novel, A Hero of Our Time, builds on the superfluous man theme with its hero Grigory Pechorin, a Byronic figure desperate for activity that will stave off his world-weariness. 1850 In the figure of the Hamlet-like Cholka Turin, Ivan Turgenev's novella The Diary of a Superfluous Man further develops the idea of the idealistic, inactive man. 1859 Idle dreamer Oblomov, in Ivan Goncharov's novel of the same name, epitomizes the laziness and inertia of the superfluous man's character. Like the main protagonist in Eugene Onegin, Alexander Pushkin was killed in a duel. In spite of this early end to his career, he is considered to be Russia's greatest poet. His work was extremely influential, particularly his masterpiece Eugene Onegin, whose eponymous hero established the concept and character of the superfluous man. A disillusioned individual, often born into wealth and privilege, the superfluous man regards the society around him with boredom, cynicism, and lack of interest, at the same time feeling himself to be morally and intellectually superior. A life unfulfilled. Set in Imperial Russia during the 1820s, Eugene Onegin is written in the form of a novel in verse, as Pushkin called it. It follows the life and destiny of Eugene Onegin, a bored landowning man about town, his friend Vladimir Lenski, a young, romantic dreamer, and the beautiful and intelligent Tatyana Larina and her vain and flirtatious sister, Olga. Tatyana falls in love with Onegin, but is rejected by him because he does not want life restricted to living in domestic bliss. Unable or unwilling to prevent tragedy, he fights a duel with Lenski, leaves his estate for some years, and returns to find that Tatyana has married someone else. Lonely Destiny. Writing in a lively and often ironic tone, Pushkin not only describes the lives of his main characters, but also introduces a large cast of other individuals. He realistically depicts scenes from Russian life, and there are numerous wide-ranging literary references and philosophical observations, some satirizing the society of the time. At the end, Eugene Onegin, who has spent most of his life distancing himself from those around him, is left regretting his lonely destiny. Pushkin's superfluous man was adopted by other writers and embedded as a recurring motif in much Russian literature of the 1840s and 1850s. See also, Tristram Shandy, A Hero of Our Time. In context. Focus. Transcendentalism before. 1840 author and literary critic Margaret Fuller and essayist and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson become founding editors of the transcendentalist journal The Dial, publishing on literature, philosophy, and religion. 1850 Emerson, spokesman of transcendentalism, proposes a general mind that expresses itself through the lives of geniuses such as Plato and Shakespeare. 1854 The rewards of a simple life in nature are described in Walden, or A Life in the Woods by Henry David Thoreau. After. 1861-65 The great U.S. poet Emily Dickinson enjoys her most prolific period. Her poems have transcendentalist overtones mixed with a fear of cosmic immensities. The Transcendentalist movement thrived in the USA in the mid-19th century, inspired by German philosopher Immanuel Kant's idea that knowledge is concerned not with objects, but our mode of knowing objects. This fusion of the intellectual and metaphysical, combined with a celebration of physicality, sexuality, and nature, characterized the work of the U.S. poet Walt Whitman and other transcendentalist writers. In praise of body and spirit. Whitman's collection Leaves of Grass contains poems such as, I Sing the Body Electric, where, at the same time as revering the soul, he displays a desire to liberate Americans from shame about the body, to foster egalitarian instincts, and to promote human connection. Song of Myself is a eulogy to all of humanity, in which the poet imagines himself returned to the cycles of nature. With the hypnotic rhythm of his verse, Whitman revels in the senses. I will go to the bank by the wood and become undisguised and naked. I am mad for it to be in contact with me. Whitman delighted in nature and its cycles, in which, for him, God was self-evidently present. He shared a conviction with the poet Emerson that humankind was innately good. And this became a hallmark of transcendentalism. Later poems in the book, such as A Noiseless Patient Spider, also show a mystic fascination with the measureless oceans of space. This is the grass that grows wherever the land is and the water is, this the common air that bathes the globe. Song of Myself. See also, Lyrical Ballads. In context. Focus slave narratives. Before 1789 the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, the African, is published in England. It is narrated by an enslaved boy from Benin. After 1853 Solomon Northup's autobiographical 12 Years a Slave contrasts the lives of free blacks in the North and enslaved blacks in the South of the USA. 1861 In Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, ex-slave Harriet Jacobs focuses on the experiences of slave women. 1979 In Octavia E. Butler's novel Kindred, a neo-slave narrative, the main character time travels between present-day California and pre-Civil War Maryland, USA. In the decades leading up to the U.S. Civil War, around 4 million slaves were held in the southern states of the USA, while abolitionists in the North campaigned to bring an end to the inhuman practice of slavery. In 1841 Frederick Douglass, a mixed-race slave who had escaped north, was invited to address an anti-slavery society meeting in Massachusetts, and was found to be a powerful orator for the cause. He went on to chronicle his life in a book that sold 5,000 copies within 4 months of its publication in 1845 and created the template for the slave narrative genre in American literature. Douglass asked in the book, "How is a man made a slave?" He told how he was removed from his slave mother within a year of his birth. Always hungry and cold, he saw overseers whipping male workers for the smallest excuse. He witnessed slaves murdered for disobedience. The young Frederick became aware that killing a slave or a colored person is not treated as a crime either by the courts or the community. It was new, dirty, and hard work for me, but I went at it with a glad heart and a willing hand. I was now my own master. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Literature as Liberation. Published by the Anti-Slavery Office, and prefaced by 2 leading abolitionists, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, was crafted in part to suit the needs of the abolitionist cause. In eloquent, compelling text laced with biblical imagery, the fugitive slave debunked myths peddled by the South, such as the ineducable character of blacks and the benign nature of slaveholding. Christianity in the South, he concluded, was a mere covering for the most horrid crimes, a justifier of the most appalling barbarity. As his story gradually unfolds, Douglass asks, how is a slave made into a man? He answers this question by writing himself into existence in a picaresque coming-of-age tale. As a boy, Frederick was taught to read and write by a mistress and quickly grasped the power of literacy to both expose injustice and unlock a future self. Although he was denied further teaching, he enlisted poor white boys and fellow workers as teachers. A turning point came when, aged 16, he won a fight with a brutal overseer. There is a strong sense of self-discovery in the rest of the story of his growing into a man. Lasting influence. After the U.S. Civil War, interest in slave narratives declined. However, the language and sentiment of the writing resurfaced in the rhetoric of activists such as Martin Luther King during the civil rights campaigns of the mid-20th century. Stories told by slaves then became central to black studies, and to the canon of American literature. The writing of narratives by slaves had a dual effect. As well as furthering the cause of the abolitionists, the texts marked the beginning of a uniquely African American literature. Frederick Douglass. The son of Harriet Bailey and an unnamed white man, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born into slavery in Maryland in February 1818. At the age of 20 he escaped to New York and married Anna Murray, a free black woman. They had 5 children. Moving to Massachusetts, Frederick adopted the name Douglas to avoid capture, and spoke regularly at abolitionist meetings. He lectured in Great Britain, where friends raised funds for his release from slavery in Baltimore in 1846. Douglas settled in New York, where he published newspapers, assisted fugitive slaves, and recruited black troops for the Union cause. After the death of his wife, he married Helen Pitts, a white editor and feminist. Douglas became U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia and Consul General for Haiti. He died in Washington, D.C., in 1895. Other key works. 1855 My Bondage and My Freedom. 1881 Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. See also, Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Invisible Man Beloved. In context. Focus. Victorian feminism after 1847. Emily Bronte publishes Wuthering Heights, exploring feminist issues of gender, domesticity, and women's status in Victorian society. 1853. Charlotte Bronte's Villette is published. It is considered a more mature reworking of her earlier themes of women's self-determination, identity, and independence. 1860. George Eliot's The Mill on the Floss contrasts themes of female intellectual growth with notions of family duty. 1892. Charlotte Perkins Gilman publishes her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, an early example of U.S. feminist literature that shows women's mental health in relation to patriarchal oppression. When Jane Eyre was first published in 1847, it was credited to Currer Bell, a pseudonym used by Charlotte Bronte to conceal her gender. The book was also subtitled an autobiography, signaling that it had borrowed from the 19th-century German Bildungsroman genre. In these coming-of-age stories, readers typically followed protagonists through their lives from childhood to adulthood as they overcame obstacles to reach maturity. Significantly, the development of selfhood and identity was often explored through male characters because at that time women were not generally thought to possess the same depth. What makes Jane Eyre radical for its time is that it assumes that women have a complex interior the equal of men's, rather than merely being superficial exteriors defined by their beauty alone. Hatton Hall, a picturesque medieval manor house in Derbyshire, England, has been used as the fictional setting of Thornfield Hall for 2 film adaptations of Jane Eyre. Charlotte Bronte. Born on April 21, 1816 in Yorkshire, England, Charlotte Bronte was the third daughter of the Reverend Patrick Bronte and his wife Maria Branwell. In 1824, she and her elder sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, were sent to a boarding school, where poor conditions resulted in a typhoid outbreak. Charlotte blamed this for the early death of Maria and Elizabeth and used her experiences at the school as the basis for Lowood in Jane Eyre. Charlotte worked as a governess and teacher. Her first novel, The Professor, was rejected and only published posthumously. The immediate success of Jane Eyre in 1847 was soon followed by tragedy, when first her brother Patrick and then her 2 remaining sisters, Emily and Anne, died. Of the 6 Bronte children, Charlotte was the lone survivor. She married Reverend A. B. Nichols in 1854, and died during childbirth in March the following year. Other key works: 1849 Shirley, 1853 Villette, 1857 The Professor. Character development. Bronte's plain, passionate, and intelligent heroine enlists her readers to follow her emotional development and her relationships, and through these to sympathize and empathize with the plight of women of her class and the inequalities in the lives of young girls and women. Unlike many contemporary male authors who presented female characters as general figures of aesthetic beauty or morality, there is no distanced contemplation of Jane as a type in the novel. The book tells the story of Jane Eyre, from her childhood as an orphan in the care of her aunt and her education at a charity boarding school, Lowood Institution, to her employment as a governess at a country house, Thornfield Hall. Bronte presents Jane as a complex, three-dimensional human being, and her readers are emotionally invested in her, from her childhood abuse to the later injustices of her lack of freedom and independence. These are expressed in numerous memorable passages that link Jane's wish for liberty and her restlessness with the language of revolt and rebellion. At Thornfield Hall, Jane meets the owner, the mysterious Mr. Rochester. She becomes embroiled in his complex affairs, in particular, with his insane first wife, Bertha Mason, who is imprisoned in the attic of the house. Unable to marry Rochester, Jane leaves Thornfield. At first she is penniless, but fate restores her fortunes, and draws her back to Rochester. Some feminists view Bertha Mason, the deranged, imprisoned wife of Edward Rochester, Jane Eyre's employer, as a metaphorical reflection of Jane and her own status in society. Bertha Mason is Jane's antagonist, but can be considered her psychological Gothic double, a feminist version of Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde. Domestic slavery. Jane Eyre's compelling story is far more than an English Bildungsroman. Bronte infused the work with the anti-slavery and revolutionary rhetoric that she and her sisters had read in many 19th-century political tracts. In Jane Eyre, this political language is not used in reference to humanity in general, but with specific regard to middle-class women in Victorian society and the domestic constraints placed upon their lives. In one of the most passionate passages of the novel, Jane tells her readers that women suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer, and it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. This plea for equality among the sexes runs throughout the novel as Jane Eyre progressively builds a case for women's need for liberty, independence, and action. These feminist aspects of the novel did not go unnoticed by Bronte's contemporaries. While many early reviews praised the novel, some criticized its radical content and unfeminine view of womanhood. Jane Eyre, however, quickly became one of the most influential literary heroines of her time. After the publication of the novel, a new type of female protagonist was apparent in Victorian literature, a plain, rebellious, and intelligent one. She offered a counterpart to the passive, sweet, pretty, and domestic heroines who were usually championed by male authors such as Charles Dickens and William Makepeace Thackeray. Female spaces. Jane Eyre opened the door for other female writers of the period to explore the limitations of women's lives and their desire for equality. It was a theme that was apparent in many of the great Victorian stories. George Eliot's Middlemarch, for example, criticizes patriarchy and its moral weaknesses, and brings the frustration of women's ambitions into focus. The reality of domestic responsibility dictating women's lives, which Bronte introduced into the Victorian novel through her own evocative use of domestic spaces in Jane Eyre, continued to haunt women writers throughout the 19th century. Many feminist readings of Jane Eyre focus on key spaces such as specific rooms, windows, and the infamous attic at Thornfield Hall in which Jane's love interest, Edward Rochester, locks up his first mad wife. The domestic sphere is intimately linked with the female body in the female self, and for this reason, much women's fiction of the time is riddled with details of domesticity. Feminist critics have argued that these are the natural fictional manifestations of women reacting to the strict boundaries and gender ideologies of the time. Madness and savagery. Jane is a woman who wants more than the predefined life of a Victorian woman, and reacts against her domestic confines as a prison from which she must escape. At a turbulent moment in their relationship, Rochester calls Jane a resolute wild free thing, noting that, whatever I do with its cage, I cannot get at it, the savage beautiful creature. His description of Jane as a savage creature in a cage could also be a description of his first wife, Bertha, who is literally caged in the attic of his home. Bertha's madness is a manifestation of the limitations that were placed on women's lives, and it mirrors Jane's sense of imprisonment throughout her life. Bertha is the most extreme and literal depiction of what happens to 19th-century women when they marry and lose their identity. She is not just a metaphor or mirror for Jane's constraint and rage, but also represents the madness of being restricted in life. Later authors produced more explicitly feminist interpretations of Bertha's predicament. When the U.S. writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman published her feminist short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, in 1892, she developed Bronte's representation of Bertha's insanity by calling into question the medical and cultural oppression of women within a patriarchal society. In her widely acclaimed 1966 novel Wide Sargasso Sea, Dominica-born British author Jean Rhys would go on to tell Bertha's story from another perspective. Bertha, a Creole woman in colonial Jamaica, marries an Englishman and is taken by him to England, where she is trapped in an oppressive patriarchal society, losing her identity and becoming mad. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. Jane Eyre. Not mad but trapped. From a feminist perspective, Jane's double is not mad, but is forbidden her freedom, like all other women. In this context, Jane's passionate comment to Rochester that, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me, I am a free human being with an independent will," becomes a poignant reminder of the social nets that trapped women in the 19th century, inducing a psychological madness within them. When Bronte wrote Jane Eyre, she, perhaps unwittingly, created not one but two feminist icons, Jane herself, and the madwoman in the attic. The madwoman in the attic. The most famous feminist interpretation of Jane Eyre is The Madwoman in the Attic by U.S. scholars Sandra M. Gilbert and Susan Guber. Published in 1979, this influential book borrows its title from Jane Eyre and examines Bronte's novel alongside the works of other female writers of the era, including Jane Austen, Mary Shelley, Emily Bronte, George Eliot, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Christina Rossetti, and Emily Dickinson. A major theme in their analysis is that of the concept of madness, in relation to the emotional, psychological, and physical confinement of women in the 19th century. The authors argue that 19th century women were represented by male writers as either angels or monsters. Women writers expressed their anxieties about these stereotypes by depicting their own female characters as either submissive or entirely mad. See also, Wuthering Heights, Middlemarch, The Magic Mountain, Wide Sargasso Sea. In context. Focus Victorian Gothic. Before 1837-39, Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist shifts the gloomy atmosphere of early Gothic fiction to the streets of London. 1840, Edgar Allan Poe writes stories of intense relationships mixed with Gothic themes of unsettling, crumbling houses, ghosts, and corpses coming back to life. 1847, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre is published. Its themes of Gothic domestic abuse and confinement are mirrored in Wuthering Heights. After 1852-53, Charles Dickens writes Bleak House and reworks the ruined Gothic castle of earlier fiction as the slum tenements of London in the development of the Victorian urban Gothic. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights is considered one of the most famous love stories in Western culture. This is, however, a questionable assessment. While the intense but doomed affair between its two main characters, Catherine and Heathcliff, is certainly captivating. Readers soon discover that, rather than romance, the novel presents a tale of violence, haunting, and abuse. In this book, Emily Brontë expands and reworks Gothic themes in a way that exposes Victorian concerns about gender, class, poverty, and domesticity. Oh, I am burning. I wish I were out of doors, I wish I were a girl again, half savage and hardy, and free. Wuthering Heights. Myth on the Moors. The story told in the novel is one of revenge, dependence, and passionate longing, centered on the manor called Wuthering Heights, set in the harsh landscape of the Yorkshire moors. It follows the life of the anti-hero, Heathcliff, an orphan adopted from the streets of Liverpool by the Earnshaw family. Heathcliff is brought up alongside the family's daughter, Catherine, and son, Hindley, and the book tells of their complex relationships and power struggles over the following years, Heathcliff's loss of his soulmate, Catherine, to Edgar Linton, and the revenge he takes. Structurally, the novel uses a framing device, a separate story within which the main narrative is presented. This frame consists in the tale of the visit of a gentleman named Lockwood to Wuthering Heights. An unsettling encounter with what he believes to be Catherine's ghost traumatizes him deeply, and he quizzes Nellie Dean, a former servant of Catherine, about the history of the house. The story recounted by Nellie unfolds for the reader as it does for Lockwood. Wuthering Heights did not enjoy immediate success when it was published in 1847, perhaps because Victorian sensibilities could not cope with its unbridled passion and cruelty. But the tide of public opinion turned when later critics championed the novel. An essay on the work by English writer Virginia Woolf in 1916 marked a shift in how the text was interpreted. Woolf describes the book as being like a fairy tale or myth that is timeless in nature. This perspective on the novel became popular and is current today. However, it tends to ignore or diminish the significance of Brontë's use of Gothic literary conventions in her narrative, and her work's own relationship with the literature and issues of its time. Gothic themes. What is particularly striking about Wuthering Heights is the way that it adapts Victorian Gothic themes. Other contemporary writers, such as Charles Dickens, used Gothic elements within realist novels, thus deepening the themes, style, and meanings associated with earlier Gothic literature. Instead of the crumbling medieval castle, for example, Dickens portrayed teetering urban landscapes, rife with poverty and exploitation. In place of the terrifying manor house, with its victimized inhabitants within, Dickens presented the horrifying abuse that occurred in the gloomy London streets outside the home. Brontë took things further than Dickens, expanding on Gothic literary traditions through the character of Heathcliff, who is brought to the house of Wuthering Heights as a boy. When he arrives in the household, and indeed throughout the story, he is referred to as a gypsy. For the Victorians, the word gypsy had several connotations. It indicated someone of a different race, and it was also used as an insult for someone who was homeless, a wanderer, and therefore to be feared. Brontë's more complex take on the Gothic is also evident in her portrayal of the conflicts within her characters' minds. Catherine, for example, when forced to choose between Heathcliff and Linton, does not sleep for 3 days and is unable to distinguish between imagination and reality. The house in Wuthering Heights is symbolic of the tumult of the story, and of the emotional turmoil of its protagonists. Rather than functioning as a place of refuge from the outside, the home is transformed into a Gothic site of abuse, fear, claustrophobia, exploitation, and oppression. Terror made me cruel, and finding it useless to attempt shaking the creature off, I pulled its wrist onto the broken pane, and rubbed it to and fro until the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. Wuthering Heights. Victorian respectability. Racial difference and working-class poverty were significant concerns for the Victorians. They fashioned their ideas of respectability and of English national identity through the idealized domestic space of the middle-class home. For example, Dickens himself often depicted cliched domestic scenes where the respectability of the bourgeois space was contrasted with the literal and moral poverty of the streets outside. Brontë, however, brought the raw realities of the outside into the home, recalling earlier Gothic narratives where households were not sites of refuge or comfort, but spaces of familial abuse. In doing so, she reveals to her contemporary reader that the slavery and homelessness associated with Heathcliff are also evident within the idealized domestic sphere. In effect, the home is no safer than the crime-ridden Gothic streets. As an abandoned waif found in Liverpool, Heathcliff has been associated not only with gypsies but also with the slave trade of the period. As a character, he may be seen as a Gothic manifestation of the outside, bringing the terror of the unfamiliar into the domestic environment. Through his strong attachment to Catherine, who, like him, experiences only neglect and abuse within the house of Wuthering Heights, his presence reveals that crime and exploitation were not simply the domain of the urban working-class poor. The wild moorland setting symbolizes the barbaric threat presented by nature. The desolate landscape, in which it is easy to get lost, is one of the book's characters. Lovers or vampires? Catherine and Heathcliff's relationship is more vampiric than romantic. They draw the life force from each other in pursuit of their needs and revenge, and often mirror each other's desires and frustrations with society. Heathcliff's plea to Catherine that, "I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul," is an indicator of how theirs is not a flowery love union, but an existential meeting of souls. Catherine utters a similar line, "Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same." For her, Heathcliff is not a source of girlish infatuation, and she even warns her sister-in-law not to idealize him as the hero of a romance book. Instead, she sees him for what he is, selfish and predatory. She is also a willfully stubborn and selfish character, and her actions mirror Heathcliff's unbending will. Bred on poverty and abused at Wuthering Heights for his lower class, Heathcliff desires social power through class elevation, money, and the ownership of property, represented by Catherine. Like other middle-class women of the period, Catherine is herself regarded as a piece of property, a feature of the household in which she is confined. For her, Heathcliff represents a weapon against the respectable middle-class world she is expected to conform to as she enters womanhood. "My great miseries in this world have been Heathcliff's miseries, and I watched and felt each from the beginning." Wuthering Heights. Gender and the domestic. The relationship between Victorian Gothic and gender is an important aspect of Wuthering Heights that is strongly evident in one of the most violent and famous passages in the novel. When the hapless Lockwood first comes to Wuthering Heights, he expects to find a typical Victorian country house, the kind of domestic home Dickens was famous for writing about, with its comforting hearthside scenes of familial bliss and harmony. Instead, he seems to stumble into the pages of a Gothic novel, where strange dogs attack him, a surly owner banishes him, and a mysterious housekeeper sends him to sleep in a haunted room. Lockwood's encounter with Catherine's child ghost in her old bedroom culminates in a startling and gory image of him deliberately rubbing the ghost's bare wrist on the jagged glass of a broken window. This violent, disturbing image could be interpreted as simple Gothic melodrama were it not for the fact that Catherine's relationship with her home is a complex one. Throughout her life, she experiences households as sites of confinement. She seeks escape from them and yet, ironically, haunts the edges of Wuthering Heights, seeking entry into it after her death. Like Heathcliff, she is a homeless character who does not belong anywhere. For her, the real Gothic terror is the house's inability to accommodate her and her desires. Instead, like Lockwood's fracturing of her skin in death, her identity is broken in life. Through her, Bronte reveals the limits of the Victorian domestic ideology that was often used to define women in the period. The destinies of two families are intertwined in Wuthering Heights. Bronte tends to repeat names, often causing confusion in the minds of readers. Imprisoned by the home. During the 19th century, women were intimately linked with the site of the home to the extent that eminent Victorian critics such as John Ruskin described women's bodies themselves as private spaces of domesticity. This claustrophobic limiting of women's lives is an issue that is echoed in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre through the literal imprisonment of a woman within the household. In Wuthering Heights, this Gothic theme of female imprisonment, expressed through Catherine, suggests that the only way out for women is through a violent self-destruction that results in a permanent homelessness. For Catherine, Victorian domestic ideology is not only a prison, it is also an existential dilemma that makes her question where she belongs and drains her of her life and vitality, leaving only a spectral shadow of her former self, first metaphorically, then literally. This is the power of Wuthering Heights and its use of Victorian Gothic elements. It reveals that the fundamental tragedy of the tale lies not in the doomed relationship between Catherine and Heathcliff, but rather in the lack of a true space of belonging for either of them. The Bronte sisters, shown here in a painting by their brother Bramwell, collaborated on literary works and explored similar themes in their writing. Emily Bronte. Born on July 30, 1818, Emily Bronte was the fifth daughter of the Reverend Patrick Bronte. The family lived in the village of Haworth, on the edge of the moors in Yorkshire, a location that had a profound influence on Emily's writing, and that of her literary sisters, Charlotte and Anne. Her mother died in 1821, and in 1824 Emily was sent with her sisters to the Clergy Daughters' School in Lancashire. After the death of her eldest sisters, Elizabeth and Maria, from typhoid, the remaining three siblings returned home. Later, at Haworth, they decided to start publishing their work under male pseudonyms, Emily's being Ellis Bell. Her only published novel was Wuthering Heights, although she and her sisters had brought out a volume of their poems the previous year. Tragically, Emily never lived to witness the success of her novel as she died from tuberculosis just a year after its publication. Other key works: 1846 poems by Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. See also, Jane Eyre, Bleak House, Oliver Twist, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. Great Expectations. In Context. Focus. Dark Romanticism before 1845. In The Raven, a poem by Edgar Allan Poe, the bird repeats the word, nevermore, to accelerate a grief-stricken lover's descent into madness. 1850. In Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, Hester Prynne has a daughter out of wedlock. The scarlet letter is A for adulteress, which she must wear on her dress. 1851. The House of the Seven Gables, also by Hawthorne, explores guilt, retribution, and atonement, with hints of the supernatural and witchcraft. After 1853. In a foreshadowing of existential literature, a legal copyist in Melville's story Bartleby, the scrivener politely refuses to accept his tasks, dwindling to mere existence. Early to mid-19th century America witnessed the development of two strands of Romanticism. One, practiced notably by Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, was Transcendentalism, an idealistic movement centered on a belief in the soul or inner light, and the inherent goodness of humans and the natural world. The other was Dark Romanticism, which took a less optimistic view of human nature. Writers such as Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Herman Melville explored ideas of the individual susceptible to sin and self-destruction, in a reaction against transcendentalist idealism. All that cracks the sinews and cakes the brain, all the subtle demonisms of life and thought, all evil, to crazy Ahab, were visibly personified, and made practically assailable in Moby Dick. Moby Dick. Herman Melville. The son of an importer and merchant, Melville was born in 1819 in New York. Starting his working life at his late father's business, he then taught at local schools, worked on his uncle's farm, and clerked in a bank. At age 20, he enrolled as cabin boy on a merchant ship sailing to Liverpool. In 1841 he got a job aboard the Acushnet, a whaling ship. An interlude of living in the Marquesas Islands in the South Pacific inspired his first novel, Typee. Later he served on further whalers and on a U.S. Navy frigate. Seafaring provided material for Moby Dick, and Melville hoped to capitalize on popular interest in marine adventure. But by the time the book was published, public interest had shifted to the American West, and Moby Dick was not seen as a masterpiece in Melville's lifetime. He died of a heart attack in 1891. Other key works: 1846 Typee, 1853 Bartleby, The Scrivener, 1857 The Confidence Man, 1888, 91 Billy Budd. The Dark Side. Both schools recognized a spiritual energy in nature, but whereas the Transcendentalists saw nature as a mediating channel between God and humanity, the Dark Romantics were less sanguine about human perfectibility. They saw nature as embodying dark, mysterious truths that humans confront at their peril. In the same spirit of pessimism, they regarded attempts at social reform as dubiously utopian. In their poetry and prose from about 1836 through the 1840s, exponents of dark romanticism often depicted individuals failing in their attempts to bring about positive change. Drawn to horror, the supernatural, and the macabre, as well as to suffering and tragedy, they were fascinated by the human propensity for evil and by the psychological consequences of sin, guilt, revenge, and insanity. Such elements were also found in Gothic literature, and paved the way for the modern horror story. As the truths the Dark Romantics sought to reveal were primitive and irrational, they favored the use of symbolism, a mode of communication that bypassed the faculty of reason. Edgar Allan Poe wrote stories and poems featuring somber, dreamlike details such as people being buried alive, decaying mansions, and a raven that inflicts psychological torment. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who found his own nightmares in the hypocrisy of Puritanism in the real world, wrote about shame and secret sin. On August 5, 1852, of the great writers of dark romanticism, Hawthorne, aged 46, and Herman Melville, aged 31, met on a hike up a mountain in Massachusetts. Melville, in the throes of writing his great whaling novel Moby Dick, was greatly inspired by the older writer's intense romantic inwardness and his rejection of conformity. Later he moved with his wife and family to live near Hawthorne, and he included a dedication to him in the opening pages of Moby Dick, which read, "In token of my admiration for your genius." Transcendentalism and dark romanticism were two opposing sides of the American Renaissance of the mid-19th century. The Transcendentalists saw both nature and people as inherently good. Conversely, for the Dark Romantics, nature was a potentially sinister force and humans infinitely fallible. The Revenge Quest. Rich in language, incident, character, and symbolism, and displaying an extraordinary depth and breadth of knowledge within its maritime subject area, Moby Dick, or The Whale, is the first great American fictional epic. It is a book driven by an intense literary ambition. From its famous opening line, "Call me Ishmael," it sweeps the reader along, following the narrator's quest to discover meaning in the damp, drizzly November of soul. In fact, Ishmael's own quest is paired with an obsessive and ultimately tragic adventure conducted by Ahab, the captain of the whaling ship Pequod, as he searches the seas for the gigantic albino sperm whale known as Moby Dick that has bitten off one of his legs below the knee. Ahab, a grand, ungodly, godlike man, who stomps around the deck on his prosthesis made from whale bone, sends out a satanic charisma. At a profound psychological level he is engaged in a battle with God, the ineffable presence behind Moby Dick's unreasoning mask, Ahab's vision of the world being one in which all objects represent something unknown, inscrutable, and malign. By striking at the whale, he strikes at God, or that unknown agent. The story of his obsession, as the novel relates it, is also an inquiry into the meaning of life and death, with insights on subjects from religion to madness. Ahab's violent craving for revenge is tempered only by his tender feelings, towards the end, for the young black deckhand named Pip, and by a short interlude of nostalgia, when he drops a single tear into the sea. Speaking to the Pequod's chief mate, Starbuck, of his 40 years of oceanic solitude, he thinks of his wife and of his little boy. These regrets are overwhelmed by his hate-filled lust for vengeance. The persona of Ahab as a hate-filled, obsessive sea captain is at first built through second-hand information and hearsay. Ahab only physically appears more than 100 pages into the novel. For all men tragically great are made so through a certain morbidness. All mortal greatness is but disease. Moby Dick. A nation afloat. The Pequod's voyage, and even the name of the ship itself, has allegorical overtones. The Pequod was a Native American tribe that was almost exterminated by the British Puritan settlers during the 17th century. The story therefore hints at the doom of a civilization brought about by unquenchable thirst for material progress, imperial expansion, white supremacy, and the exploitation of nature. The ship may be seen as a microcosm of the world, and of the USA in particular, and since Ahab's obsession infects the whole ship, a whole society is implicated. The crew are a mixture of races and creeds, reflecting the universality of Melville's vision. Working together, the shipmates are mutually dependent. Freedom of movement and communication takes place across the hierarchical boundaries of status and command. However, this diverse floating society is far from democratic. Social and racial distinctions make for inequality, and all on board bend to the iron rule of Ahab. The diversity of thoughts and feelings experienced by the crew of the whaler forms a dramatic counterpoint to the monomania of the captain and the monolithic energy of the whale that he is determined to track down and kill. The ship is a floating factory, as well as a vessel of pursuit, and Melville was fully conscious of the parallels that readers would see between the ship and U.S. capitalism, the machine age, and the market economy. The giant albino whale that gives its name to Melville's novel is a vivid symbol of Ahab's quest for vengeance. However, the animal is interpreted by other characters in various ways, depending on their education, class, and faith, or lack thereof. And of all these things the albino whale was the symbol. Moby Dick. The Bible and Prophecy. Moby Dick is an epic tale of blasphemous aspiration, and it uses biblical references to add meaning to its structure. Its two main characters, Ishmael and Ahab, are named after figures in the Bible. In Genesis 16:25, Ishmael, the illegitimate son of the patriarch Abraham, was cast out in favor of the legitimate son, Isaac. By giving his narrator this name, Melville underlines the fact that Ishmael is a wanderer and an outsider. His inexperience at whaling prevents his unqualified acceptance by the crew. Ahab, in Kings 1:21, is a ruler who covets a vineyard and obtains it by means of deceit, but is destined to come to an inglorious end. His namesake follows a loosely analogous pattern in Moby Dick, finding success in a way that seals his own doom. Melville, concerned with the machinations of chance and fate, uses prophecy to create a sense of ominous foreboding. Before Ishmael signs up on the Pequod, a character named Elijah predicts a vague doom for the vessel. Later, a prophecy by Fedallah, a harpooner, foreshadows the final stages of the narrative's trajectory. He says that the captain will die only after seeing two hearses, one not made by mortal hands, and one made of wood grown in the USA, which Ahab interprets as a sign of his surviving the voyage. Whaling ships were a regular sight in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where Melville worked and where the early parts of Moby Dick are set. The last whaler left the harbor in 1925. Moby Dick seeks thee not. It is thou, that madly seekest him. Moby Dick. Hellfire and Retribution. Ishmael comments tartly, after making the acquaintance of the harpooner Queequeg, better sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian. Such undermining of Christian orthodoxy, and of other religions too, is a strand running through the novel. Assembling the crew on deck, Ahab makes the three pagan harpooners drink from the hollow heads of their steel harpoons, in a scene that resembles a sacrilegious mass. He calls them his cardinals and their drinking vessels chalices, urging them to swear death to Moby Dick. To the harpoon point, anointed with blood, that he will use to skewer the whale, he later says mockingly in Latin, I baptize you, not in the name of the Father but in the name of the devil, a sentence that Melville described to Hawthorne as the book's secret motto. He wrote to Hawthorne that he had written a wicked book, and, in an earlier letter, that his novel was broiled in hellfire. The ship itself, painted black and festooned with the enormous teeth and bones of sperm whales, is reminiscent of the funeral ship of some dark, tribal religion. Melville describes it as a cannibal of a craft, tricking herself forth in the chaste bones of her enemies. At night, the fires used to melt the whale blubber turn it into a red hell. In this way, even the setting of the novel picks up the note of subverted faith that is so often sounded in the action and dialogue. The Nantucket whaling ship Essex encountered a large sperm whale in the Pacific Ocean in 1820 and sank. It was one of several events that inspired Melville to write Moby Dick. Drama and poetry. The book uses devices that are more often associated with drama than with novels, including soliloquies, stage directions, and even, in Chapter 40, a short dramatization. In depicting self-destructive ambition, Melville was inspired by the Elizabethan tragic hero. Ahab has echoes of Shakespeare's tragic hero-villain Macbeth, of King Lear in his heartless unreason, and of Hamlet in his impulse to avenge. In an essay of 1850, Melville wrote of admiring the deep faraway things in Shakespeare and the vital truths that are spoken by his dark characters. Melville used explicitly Shakespearean means to express his vision, from the soliloquies already mentioned to intense, elevated language to prose that actually has the cadence of blank verse. Melville also drew inspiration for the language of the book from John Milton's epic blank verse poem Paradise Lost. There are parallels too with Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The albatross brought down by the mariner is equivalent to Melville's whale. Encyclopedic elements. The use of various elements from drama and poetry, with the bold originality that helps to make Moby Dick such a major landmark in fiction, is offset by borrowings from another literary genre, the encyclopedia. As the suspense of the story is ratcheted up through a series of increasingly dramatic whale hunts, the momentum is deliberately frozen, at strategic intervals, by chapters that present a wealth of anthropological, zoological, and other factual information on whales and the activity of whaling, for example, an account of the extraction of whale oil. Or a discussion about the portrayal of whales in art. The prodigious volume and density of knowledge on display seem appropriate to Melville's experience as a self-taught man. I have swam through libraries, declares Ishmael, and Melville did the same, absorbing mountains of knowledge through his own reading, often while at sea himself. The content and tone of the encyclopedic chapters provide the novel with a vastly detailed infilling of factual realism. This helps to relate Melville's dark romantic worldview to the civilization inhabited by the book's readers, and taught to them through science and history. Queequeg, the tattooed Polynesian harpooner, is part of the international crew of the Pequod. Although said to be a pagan and a cannibal, he is calm, generous, honest, and loyal. I see in him outrageous strength, with an inscrutable malice sinewing it. Moby Dick. A compelling mix. The strands of Shakespearean drama and factual content give the novel two of its characteristic prose styles, and offset against both is a third, conversational casualness. This mode announces itself in Ishmael's second sentence and surfaces frequently in the midst of writing of elaborate impressiveness and theatrical exclamation. Genres and styles are mixed to powerful effect. Moby Dick has an encyclopedic depth and wide-ranging literary styles. Since the oceans occupy 2/3 of the Earth's surface, it could perhaps be described as a psychological drama conceived on the largest imaginable scale. With its consideration of good and evil in an indifferent cosmos, and its realization of a detailed social world, this monumental epic of fanaticism infused with a tragic vision set a new benchmark for fictional ambition. How canst thou endure without being mad? Do the heavens yet hate thee, that thou canst not go mad? Moby Dick. The Great American Novel. Writing the Great American Novel, as an expression of nationalist pride and a challenge to the European fictional canon, became an explicit ambition in the 19th century. The phrase, "Great American Novel," was devised by the novelist John De Forest in 1868. An essential qualification was that the book should capture a distinctively American ethos. A family saga addressing race and other social tensions, such as Uncle Tom's Cabin and, later, Beloved, was deemed appropriate. Some candidates for the label focused on self-creation, which in the 20th century became the cornerstone of the American dream. These themes were scrutinized in The Great Gatsby and Invisible Man. Another suitable type was the so-called mega-novel, with multiple characters and plot lines presenting a microcosm of contrasting social and philosophical ideas. Moby Dick, the first great American novel, belongs to both the second and the third of these categories, the next major contender, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, largely to the second. In the 21st century, the great American novel remains an ideal for writers and readers, although the notion has lost its swagger, and the idea of a unifying, American voice is rejected by many critics. See also, First Folio Frankenstein, Leaves of Grass, Wuthering Heights, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, The Scarlet Letter, Dracula, Gravity's Rainbow. In context. Focus serial fiction. Before 1836, 37 Charles Dickens' The Pickwick Papers is published in 20 monthly installments. It establishes the popularity and financial viability of serializing narrative fiction. 1844, 45 The Count of Monte Cristo, a thrilling adventure of a man's false imprisonment and his subsequent revenge, by Alexandre Dumas, is published in installments. After 1856 Gustave Flaubert's debut novel Madame Bovary appears in serial form in the literary magazine Revue de Paris. 1868 Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone proves so popular that it is extended from 26 to 32 serialized episodes. Readers on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean could barely contain themselves as they awaited the final installment of Charles Dickens' serialized The Old Curiosity Shop, so much so, that when the ship carrying it finally docked in New York, USA, in 1841, excited readers waiting at the port rushed forwards across the wharf, desperate to find out whether Little Nell, the novel's protagonist, had died. Such enthusiasm showed just how popular the work of Charles Dickens had become. But it also highlighted the popularity of serialization, a process by which a novel was published in episodes before being offered in book form. Improved printing technology, cheaper paper, the growth of the railways, and a rise in literacy all contributed to the emergence of serial fiction. Price, too, played a part. Readers were more willing or able to pay per episode than to buy an expensive book outright. In this way, serial fiction enabled the growth of a mass reading public. The one great principle of the English law is, to make business for itself. Bleak House. Serial pioneer. When Charles Dickens embarked on his novel-writing career, he had intended to produce a 3-volume novel, in the conventional tradition of the time. However, his publishers suggested that he write a series of articles to accompany some sporting prints. According to Dickens, "My friends told me it was a low, cheap form of publication, by which I would ruin all my hopes," but he accepted and began work on the first episode of the Pickwick Papers. It was a huge success, and from then on Dickens published all of his novels in serial form. Despite the stress involved in meeting a weekly or monthly deadline, the serial format perfectly suited Dickens' energetic and dramatic storytelling style. It also helped to create an intimacy between him and his readers. He sometimes even altered the plot of later installments in response to his readers' reactions. Mature complexity. Bleak House was published in monthly installments between March 1852 and September 1853. It was Dickens' 9th novel and is thought by many to be one of his most mature. English writer and critic G. K. Chesterton considered it to be his best novel, a view shared by many readers, then and now. An immense and complex novel, Bleak House is set mainly in London but also in Lincolnshire in the east of England. Its main theme is the iniquities of the English legal system at that time, which through delays, obfuscation, and lack of humanity, destroyed the lives of innocent individuals. Central to the story, and woven through it, is the fictional case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, a legal dispute over an inheritance that has already lasted several decades by the time the novel begins, and which has become so complicated that no man alive knows what it is. Each installment of Bleak House was accompanied by 2 illustrations by Hablot Knight Brown, enhancing the mood of the text. This illustration shows the stately home Chesney Wold. Multiple layers. However, Bleak House is not just an attack on the English legal system, it is also a murder mystery, a whodunit, and a searing exploration of the poverty, disease, and neglect that were part of 19th-century England. The novel includes plots and subplots that touch on themes of secrets, guilt, greed, self-interest, love, and kindness. Like all of Dickens' novels, it includes a huge and memorable cast of characters, who interlink with each other in ways that are both obvious and extremely subtle, most of them drawn into each other's lives through the complex web of Jarndyce and Jarndyce. Such features grew out of the serial nature of the work, its episodic creation allowing for many subplots involving numerous characters. Dickens starts to lay the basis for his story in the very first episode, introducing the reader to places, events, and several of the main characters. He also provides clues to mysteries that will eventually unfold. The book's memorable opening describes London in November, fog on the river seeping into the bones of the characters, symbolizing the confusion and corruption that emanate from the fog's densest point, the High Court of Chancery. Moving outwards to Lincolnshire, it reappears as mist around Chesney Wold, the estate of the aristocratic Lord and Lady Dedlock. We are introduced to 3 main characters, Esther Summerson, Ada Clare, and Richard Carstone. All are orphans, their lives already affected by the long-running Jarndyce and Jarndyce case. They go to live in the eponymous Bleak House with their guardian, John Jarndyce, a kindly man and benefactor who has resolutely distanced himself from the infamous lawsuit and warns his young wards to do the same. But each is touched by the case, and Carstone becomes dangerously sucked into it. Brought up as a child by a harsh aunt, and with a shameful mystery surrounding her birth, Esther plays a central role in the novel. She is a modest, shy, self-effacing young woman, who says of herself, "I know I am not very clever." Esther is also one of the 2 narrators that Dickens uses. Her first-person narrative weaves in and out of the story, describing people and events from a personal and retrospective view. She provides insight into and criticism of the other characters. The other narrator is an anonymous third-person voice that describes events in the present tense, creating dramatic tension and highlighting social injustice, the voice of conscience. Pea soupers, heavy fogs containing soot and other pollutants, were a feature of 19th-century London. In Bleak House, fog serves as a symbol of confusion and oppression. Fog everywhere. Fog up the river, where it flows among green aits and meadows, fog down the river. Bleak House. Remarkable characters. Each member of Bleak House's large cast is carefully named and presented to make social points. Characters are often larger than life, but are never oversimplified. The complexity of Dickens' characters made them compelling to readers, who followed their fortunes in installments in much the same way that today's television viewers tune into weekly soap operas. Lord and Lady Dedlock epitomize the deadness, sterility, and aloofness of the aristocracy, although the haughty coldness of Lady Dedlock hides a dark secret. Miss Flight, who befriends the young wards, is a half-crazed old woman, driven mad by the Jarndyce and Jarndyce case. Carrying a bag of documents, she haunts Chancery, expecting a day of judgment when she will release the birds she keeps in cages, whose names chillingly include ashes, waste, ruin, and despair. Crook, a scrap merchant fond of rum and obsessed by the court case, plays a critical role until one day, in a startling end to the 10th installment, he spontaneously combusts. And Tulkinghorn, Deadlock's lawyer, haunts the pages, stalking the mystery that links the Deadlocks and Esther Summerson. Neglect versus kindness. Selfishness, greed, hypocrisy, and neglect are common themes of the book. Mrs. Jellyby neglects her own children for her philanthropic interests. Self-centered model of deportment, Mr. Turveydrop shows little interest in his hard-working, impoverished son. The grotesque Smallwood family are obsessed by compound interest. And all of society neglects Joe, a poor young crossing sweeper, who is constantly told to move on. Hypocrisy is caricatured in the persons of Chadband, a greasy evangelical churchman, and Harold Skimpole, who presents himself as untouched by the monetary realities around him, yet cadges money from all his friends. By contrast,